Do you remember this scene?
Cyberspace. We're friends.
This face is worth investigating because to me, it speaks to the reality that, like the title you read, Malfoy is made, not born. If you're not familiar with this scene, for context, what is happening is that Malfoy is a regular old teenager. He goes to regular old wizard school, but because his parents happen to be Death Eaters, a choice that he did not make, he is being indoctrinated into the cult of all things Voldemort. And as we can see, on his very traumatized face, he's not at all comfortable with what's happening, but he's being forcibly exposed to acts of violence to sort of like just break him down until he becomes numb enough that he can do these sorts of things himself. And if you really want to get technical about it, the entire plot point of him being asked to kill Dumbledore, it's not just because they like want to give him a task, it's because they want to initiate him into this cult. I'm Charlie, this is That Makes Sense to Me. I got a bioethics degree, I got a philosophy degree, I used to be a physics teacher, I don't know, I read a lot of books. Let's talk about it. Whenever I read a book, I tend to try to just read the living shit out of it. I don't always write maniacal notes at the beginning of them, but this helps me remember things like this guy, homelessness at the intersection of economic stagnation and toxic masculine shame. Homelessness is rising for single men. So I write that down once and I might not remember it for the rest of my life, but I will get close. And more importantly, I know where the page number is, and then I can go cite it later, particularly running into things like this. I feel so dirty. Men internalize shame in a way that they feel they can't ask for help, and they end up being homeless more than women who could ask their community for help. That's totally an aside and has nothing to do with Malfoy. The Malfoy stuff is all up here. Honestly, Liz Plank's book, For the Love of Men, is so good I could make an entire video just reading it to you. But instead, I will leave links down below that will support my channel if you can read it yourself. It's one of those books that I cite repeatedly because it is transforming my perspective. Other one, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. I got a bunch of them that are just like core books that I find extremely important, and this one is one of them. But Malfoy. Part of why Malfoy's face is so important is because his moral revulsion actually is a lesson for us. I just made an entire video yesterday about moral revulsion if you want to click through and watch that. But it argues against something that in the culture war is referred to, or we're not necessarily called this, but is referenced as biological determinism. What is that? You probably already know, to be honest. Biological determinism has a dark and storied history in this country. It is one of the things that we have used in the past as a justification for many of the harmful things that we do. What do I mean by that? In the case of mass incarceration, for instance, we justify that we lock up Black Americans in disproportionate numbers and give them harsher consequences, sometimes deadly consequences, because we have built a mythology of Black criminality, as it is referred to by Michelle Alexander. We, in effect, use biological determinism to believe that there is some sort of biological difference between the races that justifies why we perceive the stereotypes that we see, and more importantly, morally justifies our disproportionate treatment of certain groups of people. We also use different kinds of determinism, not necessarily strictly biological determinism, but often cultural determinism in a different sense. What made the news last week was that Pope Francis had repealed the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery was a theological justification for colonialism. It was a cultural justification for basically all the horrors that founded this country, like forcibly, violently taking people off their lands and systematically destroying their languages and their cultures. We sometimes said they were just savages, a form of biological determinism, but more frequently, it was a cultural-based eugenics that said our culture is better, and therefore we have the moral justification to force it on other people. So cultural determinism, biological determinism, multiple different ways to go about discussing how we indoctrinate people into violent behavior. We'll get back to Malfoy in a second, but biological determinism in the context of healthcare specifically is incredibly pernicious and dangerous. Let me give you a couple of examples. Dorothy Roberts and Ruha Benjamin were two of the first people to really key me into this. We live in a healthcare system that discriminates. And because we live in a healthcare system that discriminates, we see differing medical outcomes by race. So we see medical discrepancies which feel like biological things. Oh, well, if more black people are dying of this disease, maybe it's not that our social determinants of health are fucked and we've built a world where we don't allow access to care. And maybe it's just a race. It was just destined to happen because of some eugenic mindset, which it is, I don't know what to say it other than evil. One example of this in a TikTok video that I did that were all kinds of viral was fetal birth weight discrepancies. You can actually see, this is one of the books that I also annotated maniacally, you can actually see a discrepancy in birth weight of actual human babies, depending on how much racism there is in the country that they are born. It's not a genetic effect, even though it looks like a genetic effect. It is in fact a social effect that is manifesting in the biology. Social effects manifesting in the biology is important because it blows away any idea of biological determinism within asterisk limits, hair splitty, like, let's make sure we're being clear with our claims. I can hear you right, I can hear you typing comments I've made on the internet. But culture affecting biology actually throws a wrench in the concept of biological determinism in the case of race in a way that is important. Let me say that in a slightly clearer way. On page 140 of Dorothy Roberts' book, Fatal Invention, researchers are asking the question of the fetal birth weight discrepancy and whether or not it is due to a genetic effect or a cultural effect. Stated in simpler terms, babies that were being born to Arabic mothers, Arabic named women, were being born with lower birth weights than white mothers. And researchers wanted to know, was this just a racial difference? Was this just something that was showing up because there's a biological difference between the races? Or was this a cultural difference that was somehow manifesting itself in the bodies of the children that were being born? You probably already know the answer based on the context that I've given you, but 9/11, as it turns out, accidentally gave us a data set to work with that worked against this concept. Post 9/11, there was an increase in anti-Arab racism. That increase in anti-Arab racism had an effect on the birth weights of children. But here's the kicker. Quote, Lauderdale found that women with Arabic names, and only Arabic named women who were pregnant in September 2001, were more likely to have a low birth weight baby compared with similar women who gave birth a year earlier. Babies who were given Arabic names had a greater risk, suggesting that pregnant women with stronger ethnic identification were affected more. What? To put this in different language, biology isn't what's making race. We are. Before we click away from this book or close this book for good, I do want to note that there is a great section on page 144 that talks about how policy can make a difference. There have been policy waves and changes over the political winds of the various centuries of our country's existence, and it has been found that the mortality gap in children, the mortality gap in, let me speak carefully. Let me just read a quote. She found that the black-white mortality gap shrank from 1966 to 1980 in tandem with a decline in socioeconomic disparities, and then began to widen again in the 1980s. What was going on in the United States during that period that could explain this momentary reduction in the health disparities? Krieger believes when we prioritize economic policies that directly support people, they help. And in fact, it increased in between 1965 and 1975. There was an increased birth weight in babies. The pounds of racism gap started to disappear as a direct effect of policy. So it's not all doom and gloom. Some of these things can be addressed and fixed because, back to Malfoy, baby, back to Malfoy, biological determinism is kind of bogus. Just as there are no meaningful distinctions between races that are not socially constructed, I want to invite you to consider that maybe there aren't that many meaningful distinctions between the genders that are not socially constructed. And I know that that might be upsetting to many of you to think, but I want to talk about ISIS and the Proud Boys and Malfoy's face. If you are a man in this country, you don't even need me to explain how much of a constricting straitjacket masculinity can be. There are all these rules around emotional expression, about where you're supposed to stand in the bathroom urinals, and whether or not you can tell your friends, I love you. There are dozens and dozens of examples in this book, and again, I literally would read you the whole thing if I had time, but I want to focus on the sense of isolation that men feel because this epidemic of loneliness affects us in a very palpable emotional way. And one of the problems, as Liz Plank reports on page 277, is that people do not just perceive that loneliness, but in fact prey on it. ISIS and the Proud Boys are two groups that repeatedly use, and other gangs or many other organizations, right, are places that prey on the isolation of men and weaponize it. Let me give you some more details. I just shot a bunch of versions of this and they ended up me being just reading you pages and pages of this book. Let's take it a little bit by bit. I personally, me, Charlie, bioethicist, YouTuber dude, is not an expert on violent extremism, but Alejandro Putel is, from a researcher from Countering Violent Extremism at University of Maryland's National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. Cool, good to know that there are people that study this. Let's learn a couple of things. Here's a quote. Emotional predation is used to recruit individuals. It's all about getting the person to feel like they are part of a community. Propaganda is to get people curious, he said. But when they start talking to recruiters, they stay for the sense of community. This isn't him, this is back to Liz Plank, who says a lot of these men who end up in organized groups aren't inherently bad to begin with, but they are easily influenced through emotional tactics that promise access to high-status masculinity to commit horrible acts of violence. Now, one of the things that might be in your head is that that's just what men do. Men are just this way. Boys will be boys, and violence is just the way of these brutish beasts that we simultaneously think are the only ones with the intellect to lead, and also believe fundamentally can't control themselves, a paradox we don't really talk about too much. But bringing it back to our previous framing, that way of understanding masculinity is biological determinism. It's a broken belief system that says your behavior is solely made up by your biological composition. It's a debunked notion, and there's a couple ways that we know that it's debunked in this book. One of the words that I haven't said yet the entire video is testosterone, and I want us to look at page 61 of this book that cites some studies discussing what testosterone does to the body. And I've been talking for too long, this video is getting way longer than I planned. I literally thought I was gonna make it in 4 minutes, so I don't know what I was thinking. But the TLDR is that testosterone doesn't have one effect on men. The effect that testosterone has is very much like our refutation of biological determinism before. The effect that testosterone has is context dependent. I can back up that claim, she can back up that claim. I don't have time to talk about it in this video because I'm running out of time, but it's on page 61 of this book. You can read it, there's a link in the bio. All of this is to say that the behavior of men, even the biological effect of testosterone itself, is more a function of the culture that you are in and less a function of some intrinsic biological determinism. And with that, we should return to Malfoy. This is a traumatized kid. This is not yet a villain. This is someone who is being warped and formed into something he clearly does not want to become. Malfoy is made and not born, and that is a fundamentally hopeful thing. It was not inevitable that he became who he was, and just like food stamp programs in the 1970s had a measurable effect on the birth weight discrepancies across races, we can make cultural changes that will have a measurable effect on the level of violence that men exhibit. Finally, as I'm thinking through what I've just filmed, I'm wondering if I didn't give you enough information about the testosterone argument, and I said I broke down the biological determinism case in the context of race, and I didn't give you enough evidence in the context of gender. To that I have a couple of thoughts. One, you can freaking read yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. Both of these books go into it, and you can read the studies that she cited. But more importantly, there's another way to frame it, which is to pull it all the way back, not from the biological determinism perspective, but to the cultural determinism perspective, and it's this. If masculinity is so baked into our biology, why must we work so hard to defend it? Repeatedly throughout this book, Liz Plank explains concepts of how we can lose our man card, we can feel emasculated, and we can need masculinity restoring rituals or experiences. If it's a true biological fact about us, we shouldn't need to reaffirm it through entirely culturally conceived ideas. And we can actually twist that logic, skirt around it to find our way to a pretty interesting proof. The fact that conservatives, I can develop this more in other videos, and I talked about it in the last one, but the fact that conservatives are so bent on legislating gender, on making rules about what is allowed and what is not, speaks to the fear that, to the recognition that gender is made up almost completely. If it was biologically determined, we wouldn't need legislation to protect it. Me painting my nails, for instance, or wearing product in my hair would have no effect on the biological elements of my masculinity. Yet, we must defend traditional gender roles with laws? Make it make sense. It doesn't. I'll probably cut that whole argument out. This video is getting too long anyway, and I didn't back that particular claim up enough, but I think I backed up the others. Cultural and biological determinism are bogus. We make up most of this stuff. There is increasing biological evidence for the fact that a lot of this is made up. I didn't even have time to talk about medical apartheid and breathing race into the machine, which are more bioethics-y books that lend even more credence to the claims that I was making before. But I've been talking for too long, and I need to edit this video and post it. I'm Charlie. This is That Makes Sense to Me. Smash the like button. Hit subscribe. Patreon is the best way to support, or if you want to buy any of these books, I've got an Amazon store that has the information. Thanks for watching, and if you're a man and you are going through the loneliness of masculinity by yourself, I encourage you to read this book, because it was foundational to me in changing how I perceived my relationship to myself and to others. Bye.